BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? And to those of you who have followed this channel for some of the other episodes, you'll know that there has been a major breakthrough in the Long Island serial killer mystery. Last weekend I did a bonus episode talking about an arrest that had been made in the case. An individual named Rex Hoyerman, an architect from New York, has been arrested and charged with 3 of the murders in the Long Island serial killer case, and we are just eagerly waiting to find out if he will indeed be charged with more, and who actually committed the crimes between 1996 and 2010 that have been attributed to the Long Island serial killer. It's a very mysterious story, and it's also one that follows a little bit more of a conventional serial killer time frame, whereas a serial killer like Jack the Ripper, there's a very small cluster of activity. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888 and created what was known as the Autumn of Terror. Perhaps a more accurate name would be the Summer and Autumn of Terror, going from August 31st to November 9th of 1888. Although I do think there's a strong possibility that the Ripper murdered Martha Tabram in the weeks prior to the murder of Polly Nichols, but that would still be the summer and fall of 1888. And before I say anything more, I would like to remind you guys that you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with these true crime discussions. Every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer, and every Friday is an Anything Goes, where any subject is fair game, and I might drop a few more bonus episodes on the weekends about the Long Island serial killer now that an arrest has been made in the case. And you can also go through some of the links in the description box, including the one for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And there is now the Black Box Online Radio membership. If you'd like to become a member using BuyMeACoffee.com, you will get bonus content and bonus features, and I'm going to be launching a members-only podcast at least once a month that I hope will be discussing subjects that are really what you guys in the comment section want to hear. Any of the members can propose a topic that would be discussed for the members-only podcast. One more time, the membership is available at BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. There's a link to that in the description box. Now, for this episode, I wanted to cover the bases first. And I've talked a lot about a memorandum that was written by Melville MacNaughton back in the 1890s. And it relates to an individual firstly named Thomas Cutbush. What happened was an inspector named Melville MacNaughton wrote this memorandum stating that there were 3 suspects that he thought were more likely to have been Jack the Ripper than Thomas Cutbush. And in a previous Jack the Ripper report, I did a segment where I shared some things about Thomas Cutbush as a suspect for and against, but I also pointed out how he became the suspect of a publication called The Sun, and they more or less did a feature saying, "This man was Jack the Ripper." And to those who follow the Zodiac Killer mystery, Thomas Cutbush sounds like the Gary Francis Post of the Jack the Ripper world. So Melville MacNaughton writes this memorandum stating that there are 3 suspects that are more likely than him to have been the Ripper. One of them is Montague John Druitt, whom I have a standalone episode about. One of them is Aaron Kosminski, whom I also have an episode about, and who is discussed widely in these Ripper discussions anywhere on the internet. And the third is Michael Ostrog, whom I've never talked about on the channel before, so I will be discussing him today to begin the show. Now, I need to say something as a preface or precondition. I think that Montague John Druitt is a very weak suspect for being Jack the Ripper, and I think Aaron Kosminski is a very strong suspect for being Jack the Ripper. But let's look at something from jacktheripper.org. Yes, I talk to you guys about a lot of Ripper websites, Whitechapel Jack, Casebook, but in this one, just going straight to jacktheripper.org. And the reason why I want to read their post is because I thought it was very well worded about Michael Ostrog as a Jack the Ripper suspect. I give them full credit and full citing. Jacktheripper.org is the source of this material if you'd like to reference it. According to the Melville McNaughton Memoranda, Michael Ostrog was a Russian doctor and a convict who was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. This man's antecedents were of the worst possible type, and his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained. As with the other names that McNaughton included on his list, Ostrog seems a likely contender for the mantle of Jack the Ripper. But once more, McNaughton appears to have known surprisingly little about yet another of his suspects. And what that means is that, for example, he stated that Montague John Druitt was a 41-year-old doctor, and Montague John Druitt committed suicide in 1888, and he was actually 31 years old, and he was a barrister, and he had a part-time job at a school, and he was not a doctor. Michael Ostrog was not known to be violent. Ostrog was a petty thief and a con artist whose adult years consisted of several long periods of incarceration. His only recorded act of violence, however, in a long criminal career was when he was arrested in 1873 by Police Superintendent Thomas Oswald, on whom he pulled a revolver at the police station. One newspaper described Michael Ostrog as having a clever head, a good education, and polished manners, and observed that he would be certain to succeed in almost any honest life which he might devote himself to, but who nevertheless is a criminal. And I think that that is actually completely consistent with serial killer behavior. I mean, a lot of people say this about serial killers. For example, look at Ted Bundy. I mean, not a doctor, but a lawyer. And Ted Bundy defended himself at the trial, and the judge is even saying something to the effect of, you're a brilliant man. I mean, you would have won this case if you weren't so obviously guilty. You would have made an excellent attorney. But Ted Bundy was indeed a real serial killer. He was convicted and then executed for his crimes. So many serial killers get accused of this. They are very intelligent, but they just put all of their abilities and all of their promise into destructive tendencies. Now, I'm not saying that Michael Ostrog did everything like that with his life. This is just a very general introduction, but I do think that that's consistent with serial killer behavior. Following a particularly harsh prison sentence of almost 10 years for pilfering a few books in a silver cup, the total of which were worth no more than £5, Ostrog was released on August 28th of 1883. And I mean, I was really surprised when I read that. 10 years? I mean, I know that it is 1873 to 1883, and might have been more valuable at the time, but 10 years? I guess that's the way the world worked back then. His 1887 arrest. By 1887, he was up to his old tricks, and he stole a metal tankard from the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. Apprehended after a chase, he was arrested and committed for the trial at the Central Criminal Court of Old Bailey. During his trial, he began to show signs of insanity, and despite the belief of several police officers and doctors that he was shamming it, he was certified insane and transferred to Surrey Pauper Lunatic Asylum, where his occupation was registered as a Jewish surgeon. And I do need to point out that Michael Ostrog is not the only Russian doctor who is a Jack the Ripper suspect. I also did a standalone episode on Dr. Alexander Pedichenko, and I even mentioned him in an episode called A Russian Jack the Ripper Suspect. The difference between Dr. Alexander Pedichenko and quote-unquote doctor, I say that loosely, Dr. Michael Ostrog, is that Alexander Pedichenko seems to be more of a legend rather than an actual person. And, I mean, that's the biggest case against him. People would just point out that there are stories that talk about how there was this guy, Alexander Petachenko, who was a lunatic who was part of a big Russian conspiracy, who was just very unstable, and he was commissioned to commit the murders, and it all just seems like it's a bunch of conspiracy ramblings. I mean, you get on casebook.org, you'll find that exact statement. There is no evidence that Alexander Petachenko ever existed, and what happens is they might have actually been talking about a real person, and then they took elements of a real person and then they combined it with some fictitious elements, and it went into some stories that were shared around, and someone named William LeCue took the stories and presented them as fact when really they were a little bit far out and not completely true. But with Michael Ostrog, getting back to this Russian doctor, it says he would be discharged on March 10th of 1888, and as far as the police to whom he was to report to regularly as a condition of his release were concerned, he disappeared without a trace. So, are you guys following that? You guys following that with Michael Ostrog? He is someone who spent 10 years in prison for stealing, and then as soon as he's out of prison, maybe, let's see, 4.5 years later, he's up to his old tricks again, as they said. He's trying to steal again. Perhaps he doesn't want to go back to prison for 10 years, so he's using the sham insanity defense, and he's supposed to report in, but he doesn't. Therefore, what happens? Well, let's see, did he go on to become Jack the Ripper, or was he just some type of petty, mild thief who tried to fool everyone? Why the police suspected him? Later that year, at the height of the Ripper scare, when the consensus amongst the police detectives were that they were looking for a lunatic with medical knowledge, they began looking into all of the asylum releases that might coincide with the start of the murders. It may have been this search that brought Ostrog's name into the investigation, which later encouraged McNaughton to include him on the list of 3 suspects. Remember, the other 2 are Druitt and Kosminski. Ostrog's failure to report to the police led his name and description to be published in the Police Gazette on the 26th of October, 1888. The description concluded with the warning, "Special attention is called to this dangerous man," and he was sent to Banstead Lunatic Asylum. Following another appeal in the Police Gazette, Ostrog was apprehended on April 17th of 1891. Certified insane, he was sent to Banstead Lunatic Asylum, where it was reported that he was suicidal but not dangerous to others. Significantly, Melville McNaughton asked the medical officer at Banstead to inform the police if Ostrog had been discharged. This happened in 1893, and as I said, the 1894 memorandum was a response to an article in The Sun, so this is 1893. He promptly returned to a life of thievery, resulting in several more prison terms. That, I think, is somewhat consistent with being a serial killer and somewhat not. A lot of serial killers have pre-existing crimes. They start out with, like, very simple offenses, and the offenses escalate. And even when you watch some videos on psychological profiling, Dr. Todd Grande talks about this a lot, about how a serial killer might have small arrest, or they get in trouble with the law for criminal deviance, and then it escalates. And the thought process is that, okay, this person commits some crimes, they get punished, but the crimes aren't that severe, so, and the punishments aren't that severe, they think, I don't care about the consequences of the actions anymore, I'm going to commit something more vicious and more heinous, because I'm either not going to get caught, or I can talk my way into getting a lower sentence, so to speak. I mean, I was just talking about Ted Bundy. He had all types of minor criminal incidents prior to committing the murders, and even somebody like the Golden State Killer once was involved with a very bizarre incident when he tried to shoplift a hammer, and that was after he had even committed the murders. These types of events are really 50-50 when it comes to serial killers. Other serial killers will just put on the facade and be like, oh, I'm just going to be the nicest guy in the world when I'm not committing the murders, and they're not going to do things like shoplifting or stealing a hammer, and others will not, so it's really not set in stone. There is nothing in Michael Ostrog's long criminal career to suggest that he was homicidal, and there are no records of him ever attacking women. Furthermore, it seems highly probable that his failure to report to the police following his release from the asylum in March of 1888 was because he decided to do something else, and that's not what it says. I'm going to take a big pause here. As I said, I began looking into Michael Ostrog because he was included in the McNaughton Memorandum, saying that he is one of the top suspects and he should be viewed as one of the top suspects. And when I read this, I thought, I'm going to put this guy at in one of the top places on the Ripper suspect list. He had medical knowledge, he was a real criminal, and perhaps he was going insane, like losing awareness of his mental faculties. And I mean, he just lost it and took out his destructive tendencies on the women of Whitechapel in 1888. And talking about escalations in criminal behavior, murdering Polly Nichols and then Annie Chapman, Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and then Mary Kelly. And I was thinking, he seems like a very reasonable suspect. But then we have Michael Ostrog was not in England during the murders. He was given a 2-year prison sentence. He was held in the lunatic wing of a French prison until his release in 1890. Since this is the crucial period over which the Ripper murders occurred, this would tend to rule him out as a suspect. Well, firstly, I absolutely don't think that it rules him out as a suspect completely, because you have to accept that he was actually in France at the time. And the second point is, it hasn't stopped anyone from including him on these Jack the Ripper suspect lists. I mean, everyone seems to include Michael Ostrog on the list and the polls, and you go through some other Jack the Ripper websites, such as Jack the Ripper Tour. They all talk frequently about Michael Ostrog. But if I had to bet my life on it, I would expect that this guy was indeed incarcerated in France. And then the only way to make him work as a Ripper suspect would be to involve some type of conspiracy, saying, well, maybe someone got him out of jail earlier and forged the records. This happened with the Jack the Ripper suspect Thomas Neal Cream, who was incarcerated abroad as well. He was serving a life in prison in America, in the state of Illinois, actually. And he was incarcerated from 1881 to 1891 for the murder of Daniel Stott. And with Thomas Neal Cream, the theory is that his brother paid a bribe in 1887 to get him out of jail early, and I guess they would have had to have forged the records. Then he came back to England and became a serial killer. The difference between Ostrog and Cream is that Thomas Neal Cream did indeed go on to become a serial killer. He was called the Lambeth Poisoner, but Jack the Ripper, I don't think so. And for Michael Ostrog, he goes from being a reasonable suspect, a Russian doctor who's going insane, to, well, a Russian doctor who's going insane and incarcerated in France. He goes from a reasonable suspect to being an unreasonable suspect. But those are my 2 cents on the subject, and if you would like to dispute that with me, you can put your ideas in the comments section down below. And once again, big thank you to jacktheripper.org. And yes, I did read some other sources, but that's the one I wanted to cite it, because I really liked how they arranged the different phases of the investigation into Michael Ostrog. And for this episode, I would also like to talk about something that was sent to me by Sam Fisher, who has shared a lot about the Zodiac Killer mystery. He actually has 2 publications out on the Zodiac Killer and his suspect, Joseph Paul Franklin. And Sam sent this to the email address, BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. Anybody can write the show there. I'm also available on Facebook and Instagram, and my social media is in the description box along with the email address. And there's an article from the New York Post called "Relative of Original Jack the Ripper Investigator Claims to Know Never Caught Serial Killer's Identity." And this is by Alyssa Guzman, July 15th of 2023, just citing the source one more time, the New York Post. A relative of former investigator of the Jack the Ripper case claims that she knows who the killer is. Sarah Bax Horton, who is a relative to an officer who conducted the original investigation, claims a man named Hyam Hyams is the real mysterious serial killer who went on a spree in London in 1888. And as I said before, I had heard of Michael Ostrog before discussing him on this channel. He's on every Jack the Ripper website. This was my absolute first exposure to Hyam Hyams. And in case you're wondering, yes, I am a newcomer to the Jack the Ripper case. And the reason why I'm doing this show is because I'm sharing my journey with you as I go through the material and we can respond to it together. Horton is a former police volunteer, and she said her detective work has led her to Hyam Hyams, who lived in the area at the same time as the murderer, and that he was a cigar worker. Therefore, that would have given him knowledge of how to use a knife. okay, now this is again something that we talk about all the time in the Ripper case. Maybe the Ripper was not a doctor. Maybe he wasn't someone who had some type of Russian appearance like I like Michael Ostrog or Dr. Alexander Pedichenko, if Pedichenko was even real. Instead, it appears that maybe it was just some guy who was really good at using a knife. And we've talked about butchers. We talked about a guy who worked in a fish market. Maybe he was working with cigars, cutting up tobacco, and maybe cutting up other things that would be used in the production of cigars. Just someone who's handling a knife all day. In addition, Hyam Hyams had a dark past littered with alcoholism, epilepsy, and paranoia. He was also arrested after he attacked his wife with a chopper, the Telegraph said. But what really convinced Horton that Hyams was the serial killer was his distinctive physical characteristics. Jack the Ripper's victims had described him as having a weird gait and a stiff arm. Whoa, now excuse me, Jack the Ripper's victims? Now when on earth did a Ripper victim ever give any testimony? These women were murdered, and it is true that in the spring of 1888, the victim Emma Smith was able to survive and give a story about what happened to her. But I certainly don't think she was attacked by Jack the Ripper. She claimed that there were multiple attackers and that more or less it was a London street gang, and I stand by that story. But I mean, all of the women that I've stated previously, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly, were murdered, and they were found dead, and they did not give any descriptions of the attacker. I mean, no, absolutely not. So, now what they probably mean are the witnesses, and there are some people who caught a glimpse of the Ripper. But as far as the records in the Ripper case, I'm actually quite surprised about how well a lot of the records were preserved back to 1888. And at the time, Hyam Hyams was 35 years old. His medical records show that he had an injury to his left arm, and that an injury to his left arm that left him unable to bend or extend the limb, and that he wasn't able to straighten his knees, leading to foot dragging. Well, I mean, I guess it's possible then that he was the Ripper, but you'd think that someone who's involved with such intense physicality with the murders would not have been able, or would have been more physically inclined, because even though I said Montague John Druitt is not a strong suspect, one of the reasons why they think he could have been the Ripper was he was extremely physically fit, because he was a cricket player, and he was actually known for his forearm strength, and in short, he's a guy who doesn't look very intimidating, but he was incredibly strong, particularly in his forearms. However, with this guy, it seems like he can't even walk right, so I think that that's actually a strike against him. The escalation path matched the increasing violence of the murders, Horton said. He was particularly violent after severe epileptic fits, which explains the periodicity of the murders. In the files, it said that witnesses stated that the killer had a peculiar gait, he was weak at the knees, and wasn't fully able to extend his legs. When he walked, he had kind of a shuffling gait. Sounds like the Zodiac Killer, come to think, which was probably a side effect of some brain damage as a result of epilepsy. And, I mean, when you phrase it like that, it sounds a little bit more convincing that, okay, maybe he just has a different way of walking, as opposed to someone who is dragging his feet when he walks. I mean, okay, I didn't know the guy personally, but I think that the first description made it sound like he was borderline physically disabled, and the second one just says that he walked in a different way. She also said that the murder stopped around the same time that Hyams was deemed a wandering lunatic by police and was incarcerated in the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in North London in 1889. This isn't the first time Hyams has been on a list of potential killers, but Horton said that he was overlooked because he had been misidentified. Well, I mean, I'm just gonna try and approach this with an open mind. When I was trying to identify the correct Hyam Hyams, I found about 5 people. It took quite a lot of work to identify his correct biographical data. Well, so much for our records being well preserved, huh? She said that he was never before fully explored as a Ripper suspect because the asylum made patient files confidential until 2013 and 2015. What drew the retired civil servant to the case was finding out that her great-great-grandfather, Harry Garrett, had been with the Metropolitan Police at Lehman Street Station in 1888, where the investigation into the Ripper was taking place. And that is the conclusion of the article. And it does appear that the records were very well preserved, but it also appears that perhaps some of these Ripperologists may not have had access to them. But I'm going to give you guys an honest answer. I need more time to look into Hyam Hyams. With somebody like Michael Ostrog, okay, I mean, if everything they say about him is true, he wasn't in England in 1888 for the majority of the year. He was incarcerated in France. Okay, I think you see where that's going. But with Hyam Hyams, he is someone who was 35 years old. He was someone who had some disabilities, but I particularly find it curious about this concept of how he had these erratic mood swings and erratic forms of paranoia and destructive behavior after epileptic seizures. So I'm going to not dismiss this suspect, and I'm going to look into him a little bit more, and to this investigator, the great-great-granddaughter of Inspector Garrett. You've intrigued me, so congratulations. But as far as kind of continuation of the Jack the Ripper report, I would like to share something with you guys on a different subject. Last week I was talking to you about the movie Jack the Ripper from 1959, and I shared the poster, and it is available on YouTube for free, and I did a Google search of it, and it appears that it's also available on Tubi. I think Tubi is a great streaming service, completely free as well. And I had the chance to watch that one, and the film is loosely based on Jack the Ripper from 1888, and some things they captured in an accurate way, and some things were definitely toned down for the movie. Jack the Ripper was an extremely violent and vicious killer who mutilated and disemboweled women. I think it was even on the IMDb page for Jack the Ripper 1959, where it said that now they didn't show any of the mutilations, and I think that's for the best. I mean, I think you can understand why a 1959 movie would choose not to do that. But with this movie, they did show the Ripper as a quote-unquote aristocrat, a man of higher society, walking around the streets of Whitechapel in elegant clothing, wearing a top hat. And I'm going to break some Black Box Online Radio rules when I say that I don't give out spoilers. I will give some spoilers, but think of it as a Dostoevsky novel. You have to talk about the contents of the novel to have a true discussion on it, and it's not only about the events that are happening, it's also about the ideas behind them. And there's this man, as I said, wearing the overcoat and the top hat, stalking the streets, roaming around the streets, and it begins by him walking up to a woman. And he says in a very unnatural voice, "Mary Clark." And I didn't know if he was talking about Mary Ann Nichols or Mary Kelly at first, but yes, indeed, they changed the name of Mary Kelly in the movie to Mary Clark, and the guy's just talking in that very, very creepy and bizarre voice. "Mary Clark, where do I find Mary Clark?" And I mean, again, it gets your attention, and the woman just says, I'm not Mary Clark. I don't know what you're talking about." And with the first crime that was committed in Jack the Ripper 1959, she is murdered. The man murders her, and then he's just seen walking away. And I really wanted to know if that was reminiscent of the murder of Martha Tabram, who was stabbed 39 times, but she was not mutilated and disemboweled like the other Ripper victims. And it's quite possible because in some of the other instances in the film, the victims are stabbed multiple times, and they show, I guess, some of the mutilating happening off camera. Like, you only see the shadow or the silhouette, the figures on the wall, like there's shadows on the wall of this person stabbing the women multiple times, and you're led to believe that he is disemboweling her, but it was not shown or featured. So the killer's just walking around, and he's looking for this woman named Mary Clark, and it's the whole theory that Jack the Ripper's final victim, Mary Kelly, was the key to everything, that she was the source of everything. And the reason why he was committing this crime spree was because he had this fixation with Mary Kelly. And so this man of high society is trying to find a girl named Mary Clark. And then, as I said, I'm going to give some spoilers, but I think you should watch the movie anyway. He locates Mary Clark at the end, and he claims that she was in love with his son, and she broke his heart, and then drove him either to madness or suicide. And that was heavily implied that he committed suicide because he felt heartbroken after losing Mary Clark. So that's why his father was roaming the streets committing the murders. And his father was actually a medical examiner, a pathologist, or someone who would work as a coroner, so to speak, conducting post-mortem investigations. And he was indeed an aristocrat called Sir David. And ultimately, he does capture Mary Clark, and she is murdered indoors, the same way that Mary Kelly was murdered indoors. But a particular difference between the movie and the real murder of Mary Kelly is that the murder of Mary Clark was interrupted, so the Ripper has to flee out of a window and run away. This is more reminiscent of Jack the Ripper's double event, which occurred on September 30th of 1888 when he attacked Liz Stride, and he wrote in the Saucy Jackie postcard, or somebody pretending to be the Ripper did, stating that the first one squealed a bit, so he had to find another victim, and he went on and found Catherine Eddowes. But that's the whole concept of the Ripper was interrupted during the mutilation, so he went looking for another woman. So you see very clearly that they took elements of one story and elements of another story, and they blended them together, elements of one victim and another victim, and they combined them into a narrative for the movie. But then ultimately, this aristocrat, Sir David, I shouldn't even call him an aristocrat, this man named Sir David, died before he could be apprehended by the police, and that's why they said this will never be a solved mystery. The mystery will always be unsolved. And I found that for a black and white film, it was actually well done in the sense that you could tell they put a lot of effort into the production. I mean, you watch some of those B movies, from the 1940s and 50s, and it's almost just like they they don't have the same special effects, so they just start shaking the camera to create motion in a scene, but it wasn't anything like that. It seemed like a lot of effort went into the creation of the movie. They probably had a reasonable budget for 1959. The acting was spot on, and it seemed just very convincing and believable. And of course, everyone who watches that is going to remember that creepy voice. Where do I find Mary Clark? So I'm going to go through some more of the Jack the Ripper movies. There are a lot of them that are available online for free, and I was really quite surprised about how many movies have been made about Jack the Ripper as opposed to some of these other serial killer stories. Like, say, The Phantom Killer, for example. I can really only think of 2 movies that have been directly made about the Phantom Killer, and they're both called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. One of them, though, is actually talking about the Phantom Killer, and the other one is what would happen if someone were obsessed with the case, so to speak. And it's called the same name, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, from 2014. But I would love to know what you guys think about Jack the Ripper, and if you want to make any movie recommendations, I would also try to go through some of those. And what do you think about Michael Ostrog as a Jack the Ripper suspect? And what do you think about Hyam Hyams as a Jack the Ripper suspect? And what do you think about how people are conducting their investigations, as well as talking about any of the Ripper movies? Okay, so that will be all from me now, and I will see you over on Instagram. Until next time.